I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Barry. You're tuning in for a deep dive with an SME episode, and joining me for this one is Shaunak Roy. Shaunak is the founder and CEO of a learning platform called Yellowdig. Yellowdig engages hundreds of thousands of students around the world using an approach that they call Gameful Learning. It's kind of like a cross between social learning or collaborative learning and gamified learning. Although, as you'll hear in our conversation, it is anything but the sort of icky word of gamified. There's actually a lot of intentionality built into the point scoring and game elements of the system. Shaunak's platform has resulted in a 200% increase in learner engagement. They think pretty deeply about this stuff and have tons of great resources on their website, which showed me that they really think deeply about social learning. In our conversation, we explore why we need a platform for social learning. You'll also hear why existing platforms like Slack and Teams, which I know many of you use to encourage collaborative learning, aren't quite cutting it, and why a tool like Yellowdig is necessary. We look at the role of intrinsic motivation and how to get learners from learning content to this social platform where they are encouraged through agency, mastery, and connectedness to take ownership of the platform and to use it as a place for them to learn in an environment that encourages it, and an environment that feels risk-free and safe to learn and make mistakes and experiment. We talk about the point system, which is the gamified elements of their platform that encourages engagement. And we learn how important it is at the very beginning when you're setting up a community, and how it becomes less and less important once certain key behaviors have been adopted and the community is sort of sustaining itself. I then pepper Shaunak with questions around issues that I know I've seen at clients. Things like, what role does management input have in the community? Do you make the community required or not? How to think about grouping people in different cohorts? Can you gate content? Should you gate content? And lastly, how do you create, what best practices have they seen to create a sense of community? Because ultimately, in the work that we do creating cohort learning experiences, and in the work that our clients, and I know many of you are doing, that's what you want. You want a learning community, a place where people feel part of a culture of learning. And I think you'll find a lot of really good advice and practical tips from this conversation with Shaunak Roy. So before we dive into that, as always, if you are enjoying this show and you're appreciating this content, please take a moment, if you're watching this on YouTube, to like and subscribe below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and review. And if you're listening on Spotify, follow the show. All of those actions can really help get the word out about what we're doing to others and try and spread some of these ideas to improve learning at companies. With that, please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Shaunak Roy. Shaunak, welcome to the show.
Oh, excited to be here, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to dive deep into the topic of social learning. Your platform, Yellowdig, specializes in social learning, and I've got a whole bunch. There are a lot of aspects to this, but for sort of those to kind of level set and explain the landscape to people listening, how would you define what is social learning?
So, social media is something, we are all familiar with. All of us are in social media in some capacity. So what we do as a company is bring that power of social media, but apply it to the learning environment. So if you imagine, let's say you're taking a program or a course, could be, some sort of a area that your company is offering, or so you probably have signed up with a certification or a program that one of the other providers have offered, oftentimes the experience that our learners go through, which is one directional knowledge transfer, which essentially means, watching a lecture, maybe doing a few exercises, and at the end of the day, kind of checking a few boxes to get a certification or get whatever they're after, which is always useful. But there is a lack of these kind of interaction that could have happened. Imagine with other learners who are in the similar journey, if you could connect with them in some capacity and ideate, discuss, question, answer. There's so many ways of interacting, but you could do that. I mean, that would be amazing. And this is something it's kind of obvious, right? I mean, people would want to do that, but it's quite hard to do, actually, if it turns out. So that's the problem we solve.
Yeah. And that's such a great point. So first of all, the one directional learning transfer, one of the things I always talk about is learning isn't the transfer of information. It's about the transformation of the learner. And I think you guys approach that the exact same, with that same ethos. So what did you look to bring? What was the sort of genesis idea behind Yellowdig as a platform to help solve this problem?
I think the genesis probably had two threads to it. So the first thread was around how do we make learning more interactive and engaging and fun? So which is, as you said, rarely the case. And the benefit of that essentially is processing, right? So imagine if you're sitting in a lecture hall or somebody is giving a presentation to us, it's very easy to get kind of zoned out, right? You never know who is actually listening, who is not, and there is no really forcing function for the learner to engage. So there is lack of processing of that information that is being delivered. And the processing happens when you interact with somebody, right? If you just make a point or discuss and engage. So I wanted to bring that into the learning environment using technology. So we are a tech company. We have built a platform that makes it very easy for designing those experiences. The other side, I would say, is that, I kind of saw that what's happening in our regular lives with social media. I mean, we can always discuss the benefits and issues with being on Facebook. A lot of people are leaving Facebook. Maybe they're going to TikTok and others. There are obvious advantages of interacting with others, but how do you kind of make that interaction much more meaningful where, rather than kind of posting something and getting likes, but I actually want to have a conversation with somebody. So that was another passion of mine. So Yellowdig is kind of, joining those two threads to kind of build up.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And how long have you been around now as a product?
So I started the company back in 2016. So it's our 7th year.
Okay.
Building
Did things
the
take
platform.
off? Yeah. Did things take off sort of more so during the pandemic? Did you see a lot more adoption during that period?
Yeah, I think, we were, I would say, quite lucky in some sense because it took us about 3 years to build a platform and kind of do the initial research that we had to do to make sure that the platform is actually delivering the results that we expect it to. So we did a variety of studies with our customers and did pretty kind of deep research in learning science to be able to see what's really going on behind the scenes. And then the pandemic happened. So I think right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think we were working with about 20 or 30 institutions, and we grew from 20 or 30 to 130 in a matter of 18 months.
Wow.
So definitely it has helped us to kind of make this topic more relevant to our clients.
And a great inflection point. I remember in researching for this, you described how you purposefully worked with small groups of users at the beginning to really understand deeply their needs. So I guess during that time and you were getting product market fit, what was missing in the market? A lot of people who listen to this and get exposed to a lot of different learning tech. What did you see was missing? What angle did you want to come at this from?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I would say is that if you think about social connections or community building or cohort-based learning, right? So what is required for those things to happen is typically if you are in a synchronous or a face-to-face environment, you have everybody together in a group and you have that discussion ongoing. So you have some sort of a framework to get those discussions started, and things happen. It takes a lot of work, but it does happen naturally once people get comfortable with one another. It is surprisingly very hard to do online. And the reason it's very hard, I mean, typically there are two approaches that kind of work. Traditionally, people have tried. Both of them don't work. But the one approach is let's give them a forum, right? I mean, let's create some sort of a group like, Discord or Slack or whatnot. There are quite a few tools out there. So you can give it to them and say that, hey, interact with one another, discuss this topic. Doesn't happen. Like some people will come in and they will have some initial discussion, but within a few days or a few weeks, everything dies out and nobody comes back, and then it's almost like a chasing them down into that forum. So it's very hard to do. The other approach that especially higher education has taken on and they have tried for a long time, which is the way they run discussion boards. So typically it's prompted. So every week you send a topic saying, okay, this week we are going to discuss this topic. The instructor will post something and they'll ask the learners to comment on it. And in that model, you get the engagement because there's some sort of a forcing function, like you have to discuss what I'm asking you to discuss, but it never leads to any sort of authentic, interesting conversation. It's typically like, oh, great discussion, maybe check this link, or I agree, or there is no real ideation that happens. There's no richness in those conversations. So typical feedback people get is that, oh, I did that, maybe I did my assignment or whatever was due, but I really didn't learn it from anybody else. So that's the problem. That is the problem that we wanted to solve. And, for us to solve that problem, I and our team, I mean, we delved into game design. I mean, I think a lot of the concept that we use at the platform is centered around how video games or online games have been using behavior-based product design for quite some time now.
Yeah. So that's a great jumping off point, because now I'm going to get into some of the real nerdy stuff in your platform, because I think it's very cool from what I could tell from researching through it. So the first thing I want to know, so game design part, I think one of the key features you guys have is that drives engagement is this point system. And you've got, and it seems like there's a lot of thought in this point system. You cap points, I think they reset, over certain time periods. You also categorize points between sharing, listening, and interacting. How do you guys use that point system for engagement?
It's a good question. So, if we think about games, right, and the real question is, why do people play games, and why are they so excited to play a game and constantly play it, right, and kind of get better at it eventually? But if it comes to a discussion, it doesn't feel like that. It always like, hey, I have to do my this or post or whatever is required. So what's the difference there? There is well-researched topics in game design which kind of centered around the theory of internal motivation. So how do we get somebody motivated to actually do and take an action? And in those motivational topics, there are three subtopics which are kind of important to happen for people to get motivated. So firstly, it's agency. Secondly, it's mastery. And third is connectedness. So what it means is that agency is something around, let's say I'm playing a game and I need to feel that my destiny is in my control. So I am the actor, I am the key actor, I'm a creator. I'm not somebody who's just receiving. I'm actually creating knowledge. I am discussing with one another, and I have full agency in terms of what I want to get out of it. It's my discussion, it's my community, as opposed to somebody kind of saying that you should do this, this. Because that's the traditional design. Agency is gone and people naturally get demotivated because they're not taking agency. And the way we do this in the point system is we have designed the way where you earn points by your contribution, and you can start a discussion, you can make comments, and each activity has various points. If somebody likes what you shared, likes meaning they reacted in a nice way, you get points for that as well. So the point system is designed to give more agency to the learner so that they become co-curator of that learning environment. 95% of the content that just generated in that community for any course or program is driven by the learners. If that ratio switches to like 50% from the instructor, 50% from the learner, we know there's a big problem. So agency is falling.
Yeah.
And I can go on. There are
So-
a few other things like mastery,
Yeah.
and we kind of dig into those.
I was going to go. Yeah, let's hit that. So because I feel like the agency is the part that makes me feel like it's me. This tool is enabling me to learn, and I get to shape what we're going to learn there. So how does mastery play into it?
So the piece around mastery is this, which is how, depends on how you want to build a community or a cohort. So traditionally, if you think about most learning designs, people are contributing something, right? They probably are writing a post or a comment, or they're responding to an assignment. They get assessed. There's an assessment piece to it, which is like, this was right or wrong. That is actually counter to mastery, because what ends up happening is that the reason video games are so popular because you can fail all the time. Like you're doing a test, you fail. There's no judgment involved, and then eventually you kind of start to learn. So mastery happens in a community where you are interacting with one another without being judged. So there is no assessment. We take assessment out. It's only participation. So all we expect you to come and participate. Doesn't matter what you say. If your peers like it, that's great. You get points for that. There is no instructor who's going to say that you have to discuss this way, or this is right, or this is wrong, which is traditionally, if there's any grading involved, we take all of that out. And as a result, we see that kind of path of growth in learners over time.
Yeah, I love that. Mastery through participation. That's
exactly
really
right.
cool. Yeah. And then connectedness, how do you bring that in?
So connectedness is essentially around the idea that you actually form meaningful connections because you are discussing with one another, as opposed to you're just posting and just getting your requirements done. If there's any requirements. So the challenge in connectedness is often, if you think about a big group of learners, let's say anytime the cohort size goes beyond like 20, 30 learners, if you have, let's say, 50 or 100, and we have cohorts which go in thousands, 5,000s also, like big, think about the massive online courses which are being offered.
Yeah.
People only form connections with a few people around them, right? I mean, even though there's an option of connecting with everybody, but you're only interacting with a few people you just randomly kind of end up interacting with because you're sitting next to one another, or in some assignment you just got it together, you did a group project together, but it doesn't really get you exposure to the entire cohort. And we do that through the point system. There are things in the point system that drives you to connect with others as broadly as possible. And our goal is everybody interacts with everybody else online, maybe in a small capacity, but they actually had one connection. They had some meaningful connection. You posted something, somebody liked it. That itself is a connection. So that drives a lot of motivation. People get excited when they're meeting people they would not meet. Like think about in a company, like I'm in different offices, I have no idea who that is, and I've seen their names around, but now suddenly I'm actually talking to that person. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I use Twitter for that purpose, and you're connecting with people all over the world over an idea, and it's so much easier to connect over an idea. It takes away all the bias that typically comes up in interactions with people, and you're just connecting over this shared idea and thirst for knowing more or learning more about that idea. I love that.
If I may, one comment on that, I think you said something very
please.
important, which is, this connecting about ideas is such a powerful thing. And if you think about social media, like if you think about a regular person, we would love to connect with people around ideas, especially people who have some point of view about anything. But it's very hard to do, right? This is where I think social media fails, where other things come in the way. You can't be very open. Like think about Twitter, right? If you go in Twitter and you really want to say something, but you're kind of judging, like if I say this thing, maybe I'm going to offend a bunch of people. Maybe there will be some other things that'll come up. Maybe my company, my boss might see this and may make some opinions around it. So there is a lot of tension in these social media platforms to actually connect over ideas. But what we find is that if you can make it private, and if you say that this platform is just for you to connect over ideas, people are a lot more comfortable to actually open up, because they know now they're not going to get judged. They are going to speak up and they're going to have discussions in this private environment.
Community, yeah. So that brings me to another point that you've sort of touched on, the level of management input or instructor input, and you said that should be lower. But I think you've written in some of the papers on your website, it shouldn't be zero. You should have the manager and instructor there. Let's talk about that a little bit. What is that for those trying to design these types of communities? Should they think about the level of management input?
We did a very interesting study with one of our partners where we actually analyzed the best outcome of a community and how does that correlate with the instructor involvement. To what extent they're actually interacting with the students versus sitting on the side and let the students kind of take it over. And the result of the study was it's a bell curve. So essentially there is an optimal level where the health of the community is the highest when instructors are involved. So to give an example, if the instructor is overly driving, think about a group, if you're sitting in a group and then your manager comes by, you're pretty much going to quiet down, say, hey, I don't want to talk anymore, right? So, so what we say is that the best way to interact is not to kind of be a community member. What you would expect a member to act as, just be that. You don't have to be anything more than that. See yourself as somebody who will drive discussion in different interesting areas that the group is not discussing. So you can see the data in the back and then kind of get into those areas. Responding to questions are great if you're adding value. If you're seeing an exceptional piece of contribution by somebody and you want to recognize that, give them an accolade or a badge that you can say that, hey, great analysis or great thinking or great ideation, whatever ways, and you can create those badges in our platform. That has a much higher impact than you kind of going and writing a half-page response to somebody, which kind of saps it down.
Yeah, I like that. So it's sort of take on a community custodian type of role, but equally be a member of that community. Just follow your curiosity.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'm glad I think I read that same paper. It was a very interesting study. We'll definitely include the link in the show notes on your guys' website. I wanted to ask this a little bit earlier actually, but how do you make that connection between maybe it's asynchronous content, the instruction, the sort of lecture piece of it, and this community? How do you get people to take that jump?
Yeah, no, that's also a great question. So the bridging between synchronous and asynchronous we see is a role of the instructor or the community manager. What we find, there are a variety of best practices that we have seen that our instructors do. They can do pretty much anything in the community, but we see some things that work really well. A great example of that is, let's say, you're going to have a discussion on this topic next week. Maybe this is the presentation topic. Posting that into the community a week before and then kind of starting a discussion around it, asking that, hey, we are going to discuss this topic. Let's have a discussion. Why didn't you guys contribute things that you have read in this topic or would be interested in talking about and things like that? And people get going on that piece. And then right before the lecture, you can or the discussion, the synchronous session, you can just go into the community and see what people are talking about and take a few pieces from that and then bring that into the synchronous session.
That's smart.
We see that work really well. I mean, suddenly people start to see that how all things connect together, and then they're more involved in the asynchronous part of it. And then the discussion can go on after that session is over, and then you can go for the next meets, whatever discussion. So you can kind of bridge that in a variety of ways. Yeah.
That's actually a really good just tactic to use. I love the idea of the best practice. Do you encourage? I mean, for your clients, these communities required that everyone in the community joins, or is it optional? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. So, in some cases, it is not possible to be required because the only way you can make it required is because there's a certification or there's some sort of thing that they're going to get out of it. And you can say that this is part of the learning design. And a lot of our clients have, certification, or if it's a higher education institution, they have a grade associated and they actually make Yellowdig part of the grade. If you do that, it becomes required almost. So you're kind of being part of it. You can decide how much you want to engage in the community, but at least you're joining the community, in some sense. That works really well, though. If it's completely optional, what we find is that, there is, always a kind of a group of people who would not join, and they would never know what the value is. We do this, like we have automated nudging strategies in the community. Like, for example, if you have joined the community, but you have not really interacted for whatever reason, we send you kind of emails where we highlight all the things that are being discussed in the community so that you can probably get hooked back into it. So we have strategies to get them back, but getting them into the community is something that has to be part of the design so that, they take it seriously.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's like,
Yeah. So, and it sounds like the bias would be towards making it optional. You want people to, like, you going back to that intrinsic motivation you talked about. You want them to want to be part of it, see it as something that helps their learning. I've been wondering, I'm sure folks listening to this might be wondering, like, okay, this all sounds great, and there's a lot of great tips and advice here, but can't we use Slack for something like this? Like, one of our existing tools. How did you approach that? Why is there a need for a new tool?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, like Slack or other discussion or other chatting software, like, Discord is another one. If you use those tools, and a lot of our clients actually start with Slack and they move to Yellowdig, and I'll explain why they do that and what benefits they see, is Slack or Teams, there are two issues there, which is, one is that it gives you the option to connect with one another. It's almost like you hope people will talk to one another, but that doesn't always happen. That's the reality, right? So just because there's a tool doesn't mean people will actually engage in a discussion. And if you're using Slack or any other similar tools to actually drive engagement, it's very hard to do. Because if you look at the design of Slack, or, we can take other examples where if you post a new comment or a post, it goes right at the bottom. Yeah. Very quickly, it'll get lost on the top. And then, if you want to find new things, it's almost very hard to find, right? It's not designed for community building. It's designed for more exchange of information quickly. Yeah. So the difference between Yellowdig and, let's say, Slack, there are three big differences, and I'll kind of highlight each of them. The first biggest difference is we are designed to drive learning engagement, and the point system creates a behavior pattern where we're encouraging certain behaviors in the platform, which is come back to the platform every week because you're earning points, but you can only earn so many points. There are leaderboards in place. There are ways you can get accolades from your instructors based on your contribution that you're making. And the very design where if you, let's say there is a post where people are engaging, it doesn't fall through, it actually bubbles up on the top. So we always highlight the most engaging content in that time, in that community, so that whenever you're coming back to the community, you don't have to kind of go back and see what people are talking about. You actually see what's being discussed, and it'll fall through. So the design of the platform is very much designed for driving that continuous engagement and build a community just by the design of it. So that's number one. Number two is, I would say, the data that we have. A very difficult question if you're using Slack is that who is not engaging? Very obviously not everybody, right? I mean, a lot of people are not engaging, but it's actually, if you're making community building and cohort building as part of the learning design, it's an important data to have. You can send them an email, you can try to engage them in a better way, but that they are not. And we have done research now where we know that people who are not engaging are naturally less interested in the program because they're not connecting with one another, right? So kind of that data week to week is an important data point, and we provide that in a variety of ways in the platform. And the third thing is essentially the pedagogy around it, which is active learning, experiential learning. I mean, our platform is not just community, it drives that active, engaged learning where we prioritize discussing current affairs, current topics. The learners are creating content. That doesn't tend to happen in Slack, where people are just asking questions. The Q&A use case is good, but it doesn't really drive this need to kind of create and curate content.
Yeah, I can see that curation effect. So does that have, over time, you can sort of like, I don't want to say like memorialize content, or you can like, some content can take on a certain value that someone who joins that community 9 months in the future would be able to see that and learn from a discussion that had happened in the past?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fully searchable. So if you had a discussion, let's say 9 months back, and a new group of people coming in, they can discuss all the discussion that happened 9 months back. People can bookmark content where you can, like, let's say you're going through content and you like something. I'll say, you know what, I want to kind of save it for me for later. So you can save it in a place where you can go back very easily. And there are a variety of moderation. I mean, one thing I also want to point out is sometimes people worry about somebody said something which is inappropriate or whatnot. And we have ways to moderate that very easily. People can flag content and it can go out of the community very quickly.
Hey, it's your host, Andrew here. I wanted to take a second just to say that if you're enjoying this podcast, we would love it if you did a couple of things for us. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. It really allows us to grow the channel and reach a lot more people like you. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, take a moment to leave us a rating and review. It's a great way to give us some feedback and to tell the world what you think about this podcast. So whether you listen to it on YouTube or you listen to it as a podcast, if you take one of those actions, it would mean the world to me and my team. Thank you. And with that, right back to the show. I know interpersonal connection is a big part of it. You talked about that a little bit between learners in the platform. Do you allow and encourage sort of DM, private messaging, like that sort of level of connection?
Yes, we have that as well. And it's kind of well integrated into the overall experience. Like the way it'll work is, let's say you are seeing a post of somebody because you're in that community, but you want to send them a private message. You can just hold on their profile and just kind of do a quick private message to them. So they will go there. So it's not a separate app. It's almost like integrated into the overall community experience.
Yeah. That makes sense. Setting up learning communities, we do this a lot at Curious Lion, and you know, a lot of clients wonder about this. Like a corporate client, for example, would have options to group people by cohort, group people by function, group people by seniority or role level. What sort of best practices have you seen or ways to think about grouping learners for this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, we see a lot of ways people, let me answer it in two ways. Like one is that random grouping is also not sometimes useful because you interacting with a manager or higher ups or different parts of the company who would traditionally you won't interact with is actually quite valuable. Because, you know, traditionally people are grouped into various groups and it ends up happening they already probably know those people and that's why they're interacting with one another. One of the advantages of online cohort building is that there is no limit, right? You can have as many people as you want in that community. We just have to design it properly. But so kind of being the ability to actually interact with a larger audience and kind of form these connections across offices, across functions, across hierarchies and all that is quite powerful. People love that because that's how they find new people, new connections and relationships. Having said that, in our platform, we know the need to actually group people. So you may have, let's say, 3 different cohorts running in parallel, and that you may want to actually completely kind of block out from 3 other cohorts that's running in a separate part of the business. So we have ways in our platform where you can set like separate networks for each set of communities so that they are housed together and the data is also sliced that way. So that as you are launching it, you can kind of restrict it to a certain way. And there are ways of like, you know, people get invited into a community. It might be an open community that you can join by itself as when you join our platform in that network. You may have to knock and get in. So there are various ways of joining those communities as well. And we work with our clients. So typically what ends up happening is when we are working with a client, we understand their strategy around building cohorts and communities, and we will provide our best practices because we have done in so many areas, and then we will work with you to design those communities and kind of launch it. And also, one of the things we do is that we also provide you data services to make sure that you know what's happening in those communities so that you have data around it as well.
Yeah, you've got experience on both the corporate side and in educational institutions, higher ed, colleges. I'm wondering sort of some of the more surprising best practices or just cool things you've seen people doing to create a sense of community. Like a lot of, everybody's creating learning communities is trying to, you touched on this earlier, like it can just peter out and die out, and so you want this sense of community that people feel ownership over, and it starts to sustain itself by itself. So what are some of the best practices you've seen that create that sense of community?
Yeah, no, that's, I think the most surprising thing that we found is that, the value of having a community, or sometimes is like, people think that, hey, if I have a community, that's great. We are going to ask questions, but there is a tremendous amount of value actually just having that community and people getting to know one another and building this relationship that can last outside of that kind of learning. Like if it's, let's say, 12-week course or 18-week course, I mean, it can last beyond that, right? Those relationships that are formed. So the thing that I noticed, the first thing that I noticed is people who do it really well, they have community as part of the entire design of the learning experience. So it's not almost like a bolt-on. Like sometimes what I mean by bolt-on is, let's say you can go and have a conversation in Slack or Discord or Microsoft Teams because that's somewhere you have discussions, but you learn here, right? That strategy is kind of from a learner standpoint, or whoever is going through that experience, that they would think about it like, okay, this is what I need to do, right? I'm taking this course, I have 50 other things going on, I have to do this thing, and this is where I can have a discussion if I want. Yeah. That doesn't really, the initial commitment is not there to actually make that space valuable. So where we see people are more successful is where they're saying that, okay, we are going to create a learning experience that's holistic, which has content, it has discussions, community building, and this is what we want to get out of it. You're going to build much more relationships as part of this experience, and that's part of the delivery. That's where the results are far superior. We've seen that thing play out quite well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just, that resonates so much with what we're doing. I mean, that is all the work we do at Curious Lion is around that holistic experience. We talk about learning culture, and to me, that's exactly what I'm hearing from you. You want your clients to create this culture of learning where it's almost not seen. I'm referring back to a video in my head of you talking about, I think, the origin story of Yellowdig, and you talk about how, someone might read a newspaper article or see a billboard, and Yellowdig is set up in a way that someone could, in that moment, share that observation in the community, and then others can interact with it and tie it to the learning. So it integrates working, living, learning all in one. They're not seen as separate things anymore. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. It just really kind of resonated. It seems like a big part of what you guys are doing.
Yep, no, I think learning in the moment is something we are trying to build more feature sets around it so that people can share, like taking a picture, and just posting in the community that, hey, I was here and this is what I saw, which my community might appreciate, is quite powerful. People sometimes undervalue those kind of interactions. One other thing that comes to my mind, I think might be interesting for you as well, which is, what we find is that, when these communities are being formed, right? So there's a lot of hesitation sometimes. Yeah. Think about this, right? Sometimes people are uncomfortable, or they are kind of conscious about having a discussion with somebody because they're not like sure, right? I mean, how would this person feel if I just reach out and make a comment? Or how would, if I like somebody's post, I mean, would they take it like, hey, maybe there's something else going on here, right? I mean, there's That's all weird. These kind of...
Yeah, totally.
So the other benefit of having a clear rule book for engaging, which is we do through the point system. We say, hey, you're earning points. This is what you do. So it's kind of all set, and you just go and do it.
Yeah.
It kind of, what do we feel that it breaks the ice sometimes? Like, it kind of, hey, you have to do it as part of it. It's kind of a little bit forced, like you have to do to earn some points. Maybe that's part of the design. But then once you have formed those relationships, people are a lot more comfortable with one another. They can get into all sorts of discussion. Then they ignore the point system. Like we see so many times, they have completely forgotten about the point system by the time they've got engaged. Something which was surprising that we found.
Yeah. Hey, having run a lot of learning communities myself, that totally makes sense. Like you need something to grease the wheels to kind of get that machine going, and then you don't need it anymore. Then it's going. Yeah. That's really cool. So I guess to wrap this up, you mentioned hundreds of clients now that have gone through this. What are some of the results you've seen them have, so that anybody listening to this who wants to get into social learning, collaborative learning, maybe wants to get, use Yellowdig for that, what sort of results can they expect to see? What are some of the cool things you've seen?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, in terms of, there are two types of results that we see. So one is, I will say there are three stakeholders in the whole learning experience: the learner, the instructor, or the designer, and the people who are funding that program.
Yeah.
And each of them have slightly different kind of focus areas or results that they're looking at. And the kind of results we deliver in each of them is, for the learner, what they will see is that if they use our platform, they're essentially maximizing relationships in that cohort. And they're forming deeper relationships with one another that otherwise may not have come together. So that's one big result. The other big result is they will also have a lot more real-time discussions. So whatever topic they're discussing could be any topic. Let's say the example leadership. Let's say that's a subject area. People will bring in examples from the real world that they heard last week. Maybe a YouTube video somebody posted on this topic or they found, and that kind of content sharing will be a lot. So that will be a new layer of content sharing that our learners appreciate a lot. So that's from a learner standpoint. From an instructor standpoint, I think what we do or deliver is essentially reducing the anxiety of getting people together. The way it works is it's just, it's a simple rule book. As if the communication can be done properly with the learning cohort, things will come together pretty fast. And it'll sustain itself without a lot of time investment, because we have automated a lot of the nudging strategies, the things that you would probably want to do. It's all automated.
Such a relief for instructors, because that's often like the part that you don't want to have to worry about. You're so focused on sort of the subject and
Yeah, and that kind of, as an instructor, and hopefully it'll be a better experience because you actually have a group of people who are interacting with one another.
Okay.
So
Exactly.
You're engaging with them. And for the funders or the people who are funding these programs, two things we provide. One is an engagement report. As you know, engagement is such a big problem right now. A lot of companies are really focusing in this area, especially after the pandemic, where people are working from home. They may be not connecting with others, and how do we know who is not connecting, who is connecting? So we provide advanced analytics in that direction, where you will know that to what extent, how many people actually engaged in these communities, to what extent they engaged, how many posts, how many comments per day, how many words they wrote, so that you have some real proof that this thing actually worked. So we provide those reports. The other thing we do is we see a lot more persistence. So people who start with these programs, they will actually finish it because we are maximizing more connectivity, and they'll also go on to the next program, much more likely. And we have done studies on these areas with our partners. We've seen these results.
That's great. What a comprehensive answer. That was awesome. Shaunak, I just want to thank you for your time today to come and share some of these things. I think the thing that's really struck me about what you're doing at Yellowdig is that you do think very deeply and research and study this field of social learning and collaborative learning. So it's pioneering that space a little bit as well for everyone. I want to leave you with sort of a closing thought or comment, and especially if folks want to kind of learn a little bit more about what you're doing, where should they go?
So if you want to find us, if you want to find me, the best way to find me is in LinkedIn. So you can go and search my name, Shaunak Roy, and I'm pretty active there if you want to have a conversation. And if you want to learn about Yellowdig, go to our website. It's yellowdig.com. And you'll find ways to connect us there. And we have a lot of studies that we talked about in our website. If you want to learn about specific things, happy to kind of, have a conversation in that area. Final thought for me is, this is something, interesting for all of us. I think the way we can solve these holistic challenges is by, forming the partnerships. We have a product that solves a very specific problem. We don't solve all the problems in learning. There are other things that we work with our partners. So I'm glad that we are having this conversation, Andrew. I mean, I'd love to learn about your work in this area. Today we focused on me, but I want to focus on you at some point, and actually see if there are ways we can work together and other clients who are working in this area, so we can forge these partnerships and really see what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, same thing's been on my mind as well. This has been great, Shaunak. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listen. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. And as a reminder, this episode is sponsored by the Learning Culture Experience, a first of its kind cohort-based learning experience for learning professionals, in which you will join a community of 50 other innovative learning professionals designing and developing cohort learning experiences that you can roll out in your companies. To find out more about the program and when the next cohort is starting, check out curiouslion.cloud/experience. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.